We've been telling Bible stories through the Bible, and I thought that I got excited about the Old Testament stories, even especially if I got to tell an Old Testament story that most of you, I was pretty sure, didn't know, and I was going to get to introduce you to it. And I get to point out all of the things that even if you knew the story, you didn't understand how it related to Jesus and all that good stuff. You know, I grew up in church, and I'm a preacher's kid myself, and for 37 years now, I've heard all the preachers tell all the same jokes. Anybody else in the same boat with me? And you just kind of give a polite laugh when they get to the punchline. But there's probably many of you here today, if I told any of those jokes, it would probably be the first time that you'd ever heard it. That's entirely possible. It might be the first time you were awake for it. But last Sunday, I had an interesting experience preaching on John chapter 3, which has got to be, at least in Western Christianity, in evangelical circles, one of the most quoted passages of Scripture in all of history. For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. We actually have a cassette tape somewhere, my parents do, of my parents trying to teach me that when I was 2 years old. I didn't learn it then, because you can hear them saying each word, and then I repeat it after them. If you did some editing, it would sound like I could say it at 2 years old. But I had such a good time. I had such a good time. I don't know if you had a good time. I hope you had a good time. But I had a good time preaching it. Because it's just, oh man, the basics, the fundamentals. You know, I forgot how good that can be. I like to preach sermons that I feel like I've never heard before. But the only problem with that is we've had the same old gospel story for over 2,000 years. And everybody needs to hear it again. And so you're gathered here today to hear it again. And we're going to talk about a story from the book of John that I know I have preached on at this church before, but it won't be the same sermon because who knows what I'm going to say. But anyways, we're going to talk about the woman at the well. And I do feel that there is some explanation necessary. Number one, the well is a very important place in biblical stories. You've got to keep in mind that not only did they not have running water back then, and we are so spoiled to running water, I believe. In fact, running water allows us to have cities with millions of people in it. Back then, no plumbing, no indoor plumbing. Cities got to maybe 100,000 people, and it was disgusting with all that sewage running in the streets. People like, out of my house, not my problem anymore. Just toss it out the window or whatever they did. God had commanded the children of Israel when they were wandering through the wilderness, you got to go number 2. You go out, so there's like a whole 2 or 3 paragraphs. You got to leave the camp. You got to leave the whole thing, and you got to take a shovel with you, and you don't see that Scripture quoted very much, although there was a mission trip that I saw that was what they had, that whole Scripture on the back of their T-shirts for that mission trip with a picture of a roll of toilet paper. So that's what happens when you let teenagers design or maybe college students design the T-shirt for the mission trip. But anyways, indoor plumbing, not only does our sewage get taken away without us thinking about it very much, but our water is brought directly to us without thinking very much about it. But where I grew up in the hills of southern Missouri, if we didn't have running water, no big deal. Take a shovel with you, and there's always going to be a life-giving spring, cold, clear, clean, tastes good kind of water around everywhere. And of course, you don't have that luxury here, right? If you drill a well, who knows what you're going to get. And especially in the desert culture, the well, if you would... Now, maybe there was a cistern dug, and several farms around here used to have cisterns. They still have them, they just don't use them anymore. Or maybe somewhere in the desert you almost magically found a spring. And you actually drilled, hand dug a well all the way down into well water. Now, of course, the meeting place here is around a well. You had a well outside the city, probably to keep it away from the sewage that was in the streets. And people would go out. And you didn't go do stuff like this in the heat of the day. It's a desert and it gets hot. You came in the morning to carry all this water back to your place because it was still cool. And you do all that hard work in the morning when it is still cool. Jesus, when he talks about himself later in the story, he's going to compare himself not to a cistern, not to a hole that you dig in the ground that catches rainwater. And it's probably pretty nasty, but it's the best you can do. He compares himself to a spring of living water, as if we were all allowed to live in God's country, the Ozarks. But anyways, it's and so the other thing that I want to explain before we go into the story is what a Samaritan is. Now, the word Samaritan, thanks to the New Testament and Jesus' story about a Samaritan later on, the word Samaritan has entered the English language as someone who does something really, really good and wonderful for people that they don't even know. In fact, if we're talking about CPR, if you find yourself in a situation where someone is unconscious and you know CPR and you jump in there and you mess it up, or maybe it wasn't the right thing to give, and you are protected by Good Samaritan laws because you were trying to be a Good Samaritan and you were trying to take care of the situation, and that person cannot sue you because maybe you botched it somehow, or maybe there was a condition involved that you didn't know and the person couldn't tell you about it because they were unconscious. But for whatever reason, you're protected by what we call Good Samaritan law. So a Samaritan is someone who does something good for other people, right? No, actually, that is not the definition. Yeah, Ralph cannot sue. You should have seen it too. It looked like the WWE when Laura just jumped on him to... She'd been wearing a big mask and... There we go. He felt it for a couple weeks, he says. But what really is a Samaritan? Well, if you want to go way back into the history of God's people, and God's people, in this case, are living in the territory that God gave them, but they had not always lived there. God gave it to them roughly 1,500 years or so before Jesus was born, and He brought them to it, and they conquered a whole bunch of it. They never really conquered all of it, and they were really organized. The northern tribes lived in the north, and the southern tribes lived in the south, and I think that's how it should be. I'm just kidding. But anyways, without going into a ton of details, later on there was a kingdom split. And the southern tribes, where the capital and the temple of God was, they maintained the same kingdom, but the 10 northern tribes said, no, we're not going to be a part of your kingdom anymore. So they split off, and they started a new capital city of the northern tribes up in northern Israel, and the name of that city was Samaria. Fast forward several hundred years, the northern tribes were conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Not because the Assyrian Empire was stronger than the God that was protecting the northern tribes, but because the northern tribes had abandoned God long ago, and He allowed this punishment because they had abandoned their worshiping of God. They were carried off into the Assyrian Empire. God warned the southern kingdom, if you keep trying to abandon worshiping me, I'm going to allow the same thing happen to you. And they held on for about 200 more years. A different world power rose to power. They were carried off by the Babylonian Empire. And at some point, some people got to stay in the northern kingdom. Some people got transplanted away. Some people got brought back because whenever the Assyrian Empire moved in people from elsewhere to settle in that area, they started having a lion problem. Can you imagine living somewhere that has a lion problem? We might have a coyote problem right here, but a lion problem, my goodness. And they contacted everyone that they had deported from the northern kingdom of Israel and said, what do we do? Your God is angry and has sent a plague of lions. I just love saying that phrase, a plague of lions. A plague of lions. I don't know, it just puts all kinds of weird imagery into my head. So anyway, some people got allowed to move back because they said, okay, to keep this God happy that's sending lions, you've got to make sacrifices this way and that way. It provided a hybrid religion in the north. A hybrid religion that says, yes, we worship God, and you can bring in your gods too. And whenever God brought His people out of exile from the other kingdom, they came back into the southern kingdom, and they cleared the land of all the pagan idols. We can't have this here anymore. We don't want God to send us into exile anymore. And they cleared the land of idols, and they rebuilt the temple, and they said, we are going to worship only God from now on. We are not going to make the same mistakes again. And they looked to the north, to their brethren in the north, and said, you guys are of mixed race and of mixed religion, and we don't want to have anything to do with you. And so in the north we have Samaritans, named for that first capital city of Samaria. The whole region became known as Samaria. And Jews don't like them. And of course the Samaritans also think they have the only way to worship the one true God, and the Jews are wrong. And so there is racial conflict between going the other way as well. Later on, when Jesus tells the story of a good Samaritan, it's intended to shock you because He's talking to a Jewish audience. What if it was a Samaritan that was kind to you when you'd fell among robbers and thieves? Oh, wow, that really makes you think deep. But we'll get to that story later.